All attend.
Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on the art of being a great IT leader, manager to leader. In a moment I'll hand you over to our host David Wright, who's Director of Professional Services here at SDI. But first let me just remind everyone listening, please do post your questions during the session and we'll come to those at the end. Okay, thank you very much. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Zoe, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. As Zoe has said, entitled The Art of Being a Great IT Leader. And it's about that bit at the end, I think, that manager to leader, which is the important part for me. We're very lucky to have with us today Charles Araujo, founder and CEO of the Institute for Digital Transformation. Charles is an internationally recognized authority on the future of IT and digital leadership. Charles is also the author of The Quantum Age of IT, a book which examines the fundamental changes affecting the IT industry right now. One of those obviously being the challenge of creating great leaders. Welcome, Charlie. Delighted you could join us today.
I'm so excited to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you. Service Desk Institute has been working very closely with the Institute for Digital Transformation to really understand how we can support service desks and IT support organizations create the leaders of the future. So today, we'll first be listening to Charles's thoughts on the differences between the old and the new and the challenges that the digital age presents IT. Then we'll gain an understanding of what you can do right now through Service Desk Institute to support aspiring leaders realize their potential. And at the end, we'll have a chance to take some questions from the audience. So without further ado, over to you, Charles. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. I am very, very excited to be here with everyone today and talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. In fact, it's pretty much been the focus of my work and the work of the Institute for the better part of the last 3 years now. And that is this question of how do we become a leader, a great IT leader specifically for this audience. And I think I want to start with the story because it really kind of frames up how all of this kind of came to be. About a year and a half ago, I was on a speaking tour in New Zealand, and it was exciting because I was invited to speak at something called the Digital Disruption Conference, and it was a little bit like New Zealand's answer to the TED Talk. It was hosted by the U.S. Embassy in partnership with the Auckland University of Technology, and we were, a whole bunch of us, about 30 speakers were invited from around the world to talk about the state of digital disruption. Well, as I mentioned, it was part of the speaking tour, so I was actually in New Zealand for about 10 days, and this conference was at the beginning of it. And so I had a time to kill, a weekend in between some speaking gigs, and a friend of mine who lives there decided to pick up me and another friend who was speaking with me at another conference, and we went to stay with her and her husband at their house out kind of in the country of New Zealand. For the weekend, and she was going to kind of do the whole tourist thing with us, and it was a lot of fun. And so we're on the way, and she says, oh, by the way, my husband's best friend and his wife will be joining us for dinner. It's like, okay, that's great. And I asked her, says, well, what do they do? And he goes, oh, well, they're dairy farmers. And I thought, okay, what am I going to have to discuss with a dairy farmer? But it was dinner and it was social, so that's fine. So we get there and we're having dinner and we're talking, and the inevitable question comes up. He looks at me and says, so Charlie, what do you do? I'm thinking, oh gosh, I better keep this simple. I work with technology, I tell him. And he kind of goes, technology, And I could just hear this thought process going where he was figuring out how he was going to change the subject. And then he says, yeah, you know, we can't do anything without our technology. In fact, I run my entire cattle herd of 500 cows with only 5 people thanks to technology. And I'm looking at him like, huh? And he goes on to explain over the next half an hour how their cows are RFID tagged and have GPS trackers on them, and they have this whole control center where it tracks where the cows are at any given moment. They have metrics on how much food they consume, how much comes out the other end. When it's time to have them milked, they go into this automated milking system that automatically tracks and scans every cow, measures their output, measures whether or not they're on any medicine, and automatically discards any of that milk because they can't use that for organic farming. It gets all put in this bin, a truck pulls up, pulls all the milk out, tracks how much they get, and he gets a check. And he says, yeah, this is really, I spend most of my time traveling around the world riding my motorcycle now. And I'm sure my mouth was just hanging on the floor, just completely flabbergasted over how technology had completely transformed the New Zealand dairy business. And the great irony, of course, is I was there talking about digital disruption, and this still was shocking to me. And at the same time, you have then this idea of what's going on in California right now. If you've been to California, I happen to be speaking to you from Southern California right this moment. It's a bright, sunny 80 degrees today. It's actually a little bit disturbing for February. But nevertheless, if you've been to the San Francisco area anytime recently, you probably encountered the Google car, and you just didn't know it. Everyone has heard about it, I think, probably now, Google's efforts to build the autonomous vehicle. And they've seen him traveling, and they've heard that maybe they've done a couple little trips around, whatever. But what most people don't know is they've actually done thousands and thousands and thousands of these trips. And they put these cars out on the road, and in fact, because they know that most drivers would freak out if they saw a car driving next to them without a driver in it, they actually put people in the driver's seat. They just don't drive the car. And they have done thousands of miles cars doing something that literally as recently as 5 years ago people said was going to be impossible, that no computer could ever do the things that the human brain does as rapidly as it does in terms of the pattern recognition that is required to drive. And yet I think at this point we are already to the point where this is now just a matter of a few years, and even that is mostly about legislation and regulation and less to do with the technology than anything else. But I think what's interesting about this is there's an article that the San Francisco Chronicle put out about a year ago that really talked about the implications of the autonomous vehicle. And while most of us think about it from a Jetsons kind of attitude, like, oh, this is really cool, I can get in a car and I can sleep, or I can read, or I can play cards with my kids, what I don't think people have fully grasped is the true impact that this has. That when the autonomous vehicle truly becomes ubiquitous, that the idea of personal car ownership probably goes away. That this idea that you're going to actually maintain your own vehicle probably doesn't make any sense any longer, because you can simply pull up an app and request a vehicle. It shows up in minutes. It takes you to where you need to go. It makes our roads much more efficient, much less congested, but it also has tremendous impacts on things like car dealerships, which are a massive source of tax revenue in most localities, auto repair shops, car rental agencies. The implications go even further if you start thinking about it. It's not just about personal vehicles, but what about delivery vehicles? And you have people like Amazon exploring how the combination of autonomous vehicles and drones starts changing the entire delivery mechanisms. Long-haul trucking will probably be dramatically impacted as we go away from actual drivers driving these trucks to autonomous big trucks moving goods across countries. So we start thinking about the ramifications, and really, if we look at these two things in concert, we see that we are at the cusp of a fundamental shift in how everything operates. And in fact, I would argue that we are reaching this point in which the industrial era is actually decomposing, deconstructing, falling away, and that everything that we think we know about how the world works is in fact changing, is in fact being turned upside down on its head. We are seeing examples across the spectrum of organizations. Some of the more prominent ones, I think, right now is this idea of the flattening of the management models. Probably most famously recently is a company called Zappos, which got acquired by Amazon about a year ago. They've gone on record that they're going to a flat management model in which there are literally no managers in the organization at all. And while that sounds crazy, the truth is that it's been pioneered by companies like W. L. Gore and a company called Morningstar in Northern California for over 20 years. These organizations have been operating with these self-organizing teams for quite some time, and so we are starting to see this become much more prevalent in organizations of all sizes. But people will sometimes argue with me and say, yeah, but Charlie, that's in small companies. You can't do that in these really large organizations. And I guess the proof will be in time, but we are seeing evidence already of significant shifts in the way even the largest companies in the world and large organizations in the world are organized and operated. There's a very large pharmaceutical company on the east coast of the U.S. that is, I guarantee, a company who you would know if I were to name them, but they're a very large organization, and they have this huge corporate headquarters that they are literally abandoning. They're sending their people home, putting them in business units that are smaller in nature so that they can operate more agilely, and they are literally going to attempt to sell off this corporate headquarters. There's another very large Fortune 500 company in California that, again, sold its corporate headquarters, moved most of its people out into the business units, relocated into a few floors of a high-rise, and took away offices for everybody, including the CEO. And while I won't say they went to a flat management model, they clearly flattened it significantly, and have attempted to do this because for the same reason that everyone is right now, is that everyone is attempting to figure out how they can compete in this world in which the rules that used to apply don't anymore. Everything is changing, and that we've got this whole rash of competitors that are technology startups, but that term is starting to shift as well, but that are changing how the business is done. They are disrupting everything. And I think that leads us to what I believe is the rise of something called the movie studio business model. And if you happen to be with us at the SDI conference last year, I talked about this a little bit in my keynote, and I'm sure that this year's conference is going to be just as amazing. But what I talked about is this idea that the movies and the way movies are made is actually, I think, going to be a model for how almost all business is done in the future. I don't know if you pay attention to it, but most people don't really understand how movies actually get made. My father was a LA County Sheriff. If you've heard me speak or read my book, I talk a lot about my father. He was LA County Sheriff for about 30 years and then went on to become the Director of Executive Security Operations at NBC Universal. And when he just started this job, he's on touring the backlot on one of these little golf carts with the head of the backlot of the studio. And he turns to him and he says, Charlie, my father's name is also Charlie, he says, Charlie, the very first thing you need to understand is we don't actually make movies here. And my dad being, you know, a cop, he kind of looks at him and says, what are you talking about? He says, well, you have to understand that we're basically a landlord and an insurance company. He says, we provide infrastructure that people use to make movies, and then we provide the financial systems to help them get that movie made and distributed. But we don't actually make the movie. It's other people that make the movie. They use our facilities and our financial systems to do it. And it kind of left my dad scratching his head a little bit, but it is a fascinating process. And if you watch a movie, that's what's happening. When you see all those logos at the beginning of the movie, that's because there's a production company that has their logo there. The director probably has their own company, and it's their logo. If the actors are big enough, they probably have their own company as well, and so on. And a movie studio actually brings together a collection of people, a collection of companies and independent experts in the form of actors and different positions within the movie, cobbles them together, gets a movie produced, i.e. produces a product, gets it into the market, and then it serves its useful life cycle in the market. It gets sunset, they disband the team, and they start all over. And I believe that that is the era that we're moving into, that most organizations, our large organizations, are going to start operating this way. And that's because we need the infrastructure, we need the financial security, we need the risk management that only a very large organization can provide us. But they can't be agile enough if they own everything. They can't move quickly enough as the market shifts if everyone works for them. And so I think we're moving into this era in which we're going to have this highly diverse ecosystem of organizations that are constantly coming together to produce products, and by the way, those product life cycles are going to continue to shorten. It used to be we had years to develop a product and decades in which to sell that product, and now that entire cycle is often being reduced to 12 to 18 months. So all of this is bringing us to the point that I believe that you can say we are now firmly moving into the digital era. And in this digital era, the ramifications are significant because all of the rules that we are used to of the way that our institutions would work, and we knew what the game plan was. We knew exactly how to operate. It's all being turned upside down. It's changing. And so the question is, and this is the real point of this conversation today, is what does it mean to you as a professional? Where does this take us? And I think it brings to mind this question of what is the difference between management and leadership? Peter Drucker is famous for saying that management is doing things right, but that leadership is doing the right things. And I think this is really critical because the truth be told, in the industrial era, we kind of use these terms interchangeably. I'm as guilty as anybody of saying that, well, senior leadership is doing this. Well, what I'm really saying is senior management, the executive management, right? But we have this hope, this belief that the people on top are in fact leaders, but that may or may not be true, first of all. But I think the real issue is as we move into this digital era, as we move into an era of the movie studio business model, the rules start to shift, and we have much less need for management, at least in the traditional sense. This idea becomes that suddenly when people don't work for you anymore, then you can't manage them. When we have this whole collection of organizations that are coming together, the rules of how we used to manage things, quote unquote, shift. And the big message here is that as we move into this digital era, that we have to understand that industrial era leadership is just not the same thing as digital era leadership. And that's to say, it's because when we talked about industrial era leadership, we were mostly talking about management. And so we're going to this point at which we move from this idea that you're going to manage your team to this idea that you're going to be leading an inter-organizational team, a team made up of people from organizations in which they don't actually work for you. We're going to go from this kind of quaint idea of we're going to create this nice 5-year strategic plan and then execute it point by point to this idea that we're going to be adapting on an ongoing, continuous basis because the market is changing so rapidly that there's no such thing as a 5-year strategic plan. We go from this idea of having to think that we're going to hire the best players for our team, which is important, but to this recognition that that may be less important than speed, that we're going to be rapidly assembling and disbanding teams, so we're going to have to get really good at picking the right people for the right situation, putting them to use, and then understanding when it's time to disband that team and move on to the next. And so I'm not going to read all of these. You can read through the rest of them, but it's this idea that we're in this different time where organizations are going to be reshaped, and I think literally deconstructed and rebuilt. And it's all going to be around this creating this culture of speed and agility. And I think the challenge for you as a professional is how do you deal with that? How do you embrace that? And what do you do next with it? And I think the key message here is that you have to rediscover the true essence of real leadership. Here's what's kind of funny is I talk about this as if it's new, and I think there's a whole lot that is new. Our environment is new, the technology is changing, but the fundamentals of leadership, in fact, that we're going to talk about here in a minute really aren't new. It's just that we haven't really addressed them because there hasn't been a whole lot of opportunity to do that. And so this is about rediscovering and really sinking your teeth into what it means to be a leader. But before I get to that, I really want to reinforce how important this is. This is from a report put out by the Institute for the Future. When they did some research and they interviewed business executives from around the world, and just so we're clear so that you don't think this is limited in any way, they interviewed a total of 3,600 executives from companies of all sizes across 18 different countries. And this is what they found. They found that the things that they're looking, these are not individual attributes, this is for the businesses are going to, if they're going to succeed and thrive in the future, that they have to be able to spot new opportunities in the market. They need to be able to demonstrate trust and transparency to their customers. They need to be able to innovate, but they need to be doing it in an agile manner. They need to create these unique and personalized experiences for their customers, and they need to be always on, operating continuously without separation. But here's the key point of this, is that when they asked these same executives, so how are you doing with this? They said that only 10% of them said they were doing a good job with it. This is a massive gap right now that organizations are recognizing the challenge but don't always understand the pathway to the solution. This is from another report by IDG Enterprise where they were asking business and IT executives, what skills do you need in your IT professionals today? And while everyone acknowledged technical skills are still important, the top 3 that people said they required were business savvy, the ability to collaborate, and the ability to innovate. You see, these organizations can see the future unfolding in front of them, and they're trying to build the team that's going to take their organization into the future. And when you combine all these pieces together, what you start to see is that as the models flatten, as the business models shift, as the market moves faster, the real question is, how do you go from a focus on managing to a focus on leading? Because what they're really saying when you decipher all of this is they're saying they need leaders. They need leaders at every part of the organization. They need leaders who don't have anyone who work for them, people that can lead these teams from across different organizations in these challenging and fast-moving marketplaces. That's what they're looking for. And so the question for you is, how are you going to do that? How are you going to transform yourself from a manager to a leader? What does that look like? I believe the answer is actually in 4 steps, and I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly and talk about how these all fit together. And these may seem somewhat counterintuitive, so just kind of hang with me here and we'll maybe answer some questions if you have any here at the end of this. But here's the first step. The first step, I think, is you have to kind of ditch the classroom. And I think it's always funny because the very first thing I think you need to understand is that most of our educational systems as we know them today, from our formal education as well as the kind of training models that we leverage today in most of our corporate environments, are actually industrial age artifices. And what I mean by that is that as the industrial barons were coming to power about 150 years ago, they realized that they needed a workforce that was compliant and that could do repetitive jobs reliably. And so our educational system has largely been based around building this type of worker, a person that can come in and do a job repetitively over and over again and do it with some consistency. But the challenge is that isn't actually how we learn best. This idea of the traditional classroom learning just doesn't work all that well. In fact, I think if we think about how we learn as children, we learn very differently. I actually think it's always funny, if you are a fan of movies, talking about movies again, when you're ever watching one of these action films and there's some ragtag group of folks that are going to take on some other group that has all the power, and you know, they're the underdogs, and there's always this montage scene, right, where they see them preparing for the big battle. And if you think about it, you know, here's what you don't see. You don't see the head knight or the chief archer standing up in front of them, sitting at desks, explaining to them how they're going to battle. Now, what do they show in these scenes? They show them practicing, training, where they're actually doing the sword fighting. They're firing the bows and arrows, and they're learning by what works and what doesn't. They're getting hurt. They're getting beat up, but they're learning. That's how we as humans actually learn. We learn through experience. We learn by trying and failing, and we learn from asking our friends or asking our peers, right? And again, if you go back to when we're kids, that's exactly what happens. Before we ever start the formal educational process, we've learned, in fact, some experts say as much as 80% of everything we learn before we go to school. And we learn it by getting out there, trying things, failing, finding that, oh gosh, if I do that, that hurts. We learn by asking our friends, hey, what did you do? How did you do that? And then we keep repeating that process over and over and over again. And that is the way that if you're going to become a leader for the digital era, there is no class on this. There is no way to simply go forward and have someone tell you what to do. You're going to have to get out there and do it yourself. You're going to have to try it, you're going to have to fail, and you're going to have to do this with a collection of friends, of peers that help you through that process, support yourself. And that's, I think, the most important first step. The second step is that you need to commit yourself to continuous improvement. I know that probably a fair number of you have some experience in the IT service management industry, and I always think this is hilarious because we love to talk about continuous improvement. But the problem is we apply it to process. We apply it to everybody else. We don't actually apply it to ourselves. And I think that we have to start with this idea that improving yourself is actually more important than improving any process or improving the technology. That you need to invest in yourself, you need to embrace this idea of lifelong learning. I think you need to kind of come to terms with the fact that this is not a one and done. You're not going to go to a class, you're not going to get a certificate that says, okay, you're now. This is a process that you're going to have to embrace that frankly never ends. And in fact, if you take these first 2 steps and you put them together, what you have is this repeating cycle. If you're a fan of ITIL, one of my favorite terms around how do you embrace service management is you adopt and adapt, and really that is a tried and true practice that you need to apply in your life on a day-to-day basis. That as you go through, you try things, you experiment, you fail, you learn from those. Once you've learned, you then figure out how to adopt that practice, those principles that you've learned, and then adapt it to your life so you can use them fruitfully, and then you keep repeating this process over and over and over again. And this is really a way of being. It's not something, well, I shouldn't say, I think it does come naturally to us. It doesn't feel natural in our corporate worlds that we've built. It can feel a little odd, this idea of this organic kind of learning life cycle. But if you take yourself out of your professional world, you'll notice that this is what you do all the time. And so my challenge for you is that you need to commit to doing this on a professional level as well. The third step is going to be this idea that you need to change your mindset. And as we think about, and this is actually, I think, very, very important and maybe subtle, but as we think about the shifts, as we move from the industrial era to the digital era, what this really looks like, we find that the biggest challenge I think that most of us are going to have, particularly if you're in a management role today, I would say very particularly if you're in a middle management role today, is that we have this sense, this idea, again, from the hierarchical industrial age models that we are in control. And I liken it to the difference between driving a powerboat and sailing a sailboat. I don't know if any of you sail or any of you are into boats. I love to sail, and powerboats for me don't do anything because they're like driving a car. You pull it out, you point the boat in the direction you want to go, you add power, and off you go. You're in complete control because that power gives you control over you don't care about the waves or the current or the wind or anything else. Sailing a sailboat, however, is a much different experience. See, you may be the captain of that sailboat, and you can direct where you want that sailboat to end up, but you can't really control how it's going to get there because you have to deal with the current, with the waves, the frequency and the pitch. You have to deal with the wind. You might not have any, or it's coming in different directions, and no matter how much wind or where the wind is coming from, there's it's pretty much guaranteed that direction and force is going to change. And so when you're sailing a sailboat, you're not really in control, at least not fully. You may be the one leading where that boat is going to end up, but you have to be finessing it to reading all the different environmental elements around you to figure out how you're going to get that boat there. And I think as we move from the industrial era to the digital era and we move from manager to a leader, it's a lot like moving from a powerboat to a sailboat, that you have to get comfortable that you're not in charge. You just have to kind of let that go and realize that your job is to get this boat or your team to the finish line, to the end goal. But that to do that, you're going to have to do a lot of tacking, you're going to have to do a lot of back and forth, and you're going to have to respond and react to everything that's going on around you. But I think the key to this is you have to learn to enjoy that to see that as the challenge, and to recognize, to kind of let go of this idea that you're in control and say, hey, this is going to be fun. And it's honestly why I enjoy sailing, because driving a powerboat, well, yeah, okay, it's, you're out on the water, but a sailboat, that's a challenge. And I think that as we move from being a manager to a leader, it's that same kind of thing, that it feels amazing when we get there. I was told I'm trying to keep this to 30 minutes. I'm going to keep moving, but I can talk about this stuff forever. The fourth step, this is the actual, I think, the brass tacks of this, is you need to focus on the skills that I think are going to be most important in the digital era. And again, kind of going back to my point, the funny part about this is that these aren't, in fact, new. These are kind of the core of leadership. But we need to bring them out and bring them to the forefront because, again, it's easy to kind of mix up the skills that we would think about from a management perspective. The first of those is listening. And that sounds so simple, and it is, but it is so absolutely critical. The idea of teaching yourself to be an active listener may be, in fact, the most underrated, but also the most easily developed skill that we're going to talk about. It is so important because people need to be heard. They need to feel that you're listening to them, and it becomes the key to how you understand where the markets are shifting and how you need to adapt your team to move forward in the future because of your ability to listen and to truly understand what's going on. The second skill is this idea of visioning, and I'm not so much crazy about this word, but I can't come up with another one right now. So it's this idea that you have to be able to envision a future and then inspire others to see it with you, to want to be a part of that. And the last is this idea that you need to bring the servant's attitude to everything you do. And it's not about being subservient. It's about helping people understand that you're there to help them be successful. I'll never forget, early in my career, this is 20 some odd years ago, I was working for a healthcare company, and I was divorced, had 2 young kids, and I was behind on this project. We had this massive project we were working on. And so I figured I was going to bring my kids in on a Saturday. I brought a bunch of coloring books, and I said, I'm going to sit them in the corner and hope they'll be quiet so I can get this work done and get caught up. And I walked into my office, and to my shock and horror, my CIO was sitting at her desk, which was just across from my cubicle. And I'm sure I had this deer-in-the-headlights look on my face when she saw me. And she looks at me for a second, and she gets up, and without another word, she goes, "I've got this." And she took my kids and for the next 3 hours played with them so that I could get my work done. That is probably one of the most telling moments in my career that really taught me this idea of serving her. She saw that her job was to do whatever it took to make me successful, to remove barriers that were going to stop me from achieving the results that she needed me to achieve. That's what it means to be a servant leader in this. And I think if we take a second, or if you take a second and think about who the great leaders are in your life, the people that have inspired you, that you've wanted to follow, they have these attributes. You felt heard when you interacted with them. They understood you. They listened to you intently. They may not have done everything you asked or took every suggestion or advice that you gave them, but you knew that they heard you, that they listened intently. They crafted an amazing vision of the future that you got excited about, that you saw yourself in, that you saw yourself being a part of creating. And they went out of their way to make sure that you had the resources that you needed and that they removed the barriers that were in your way so that you could be successful in helping them realize that vision. That's what being a leader is. And while that has been to a certain extent reserved for management in the past in the industrial era, as we move into the digital era, we need this at every single level, whether anybody works for you or not. And that's what this is really about. So here's my call to action for you, is that the time to act is now. That whether you believe it or not, whether you accept it or not, this transformation is underway and it is happening at light speed. And so you need to figure out how you're going to position yourself for this future, because all of the rules, everything that you know about how the world has worked is in fact changing. And while there's a number of different ways to approach this, I want to give you one idea that I think has been proven to be one of the most powerful approaches to developing leadership skills. Because like I said, doing it in the classroom is very tough. Frankly, doing it by yourself alone is very tough. So this idea of something called a peer advisory group, they're also known as Mastermind Group, is I think one of the most powerful constructs for leadership development. The first thing you need to understand is these are literally thousands of years old, the idea behind this. If you ever participated in a Socratic seminar in college, you were a part of a mastermind group or a peer advisory group. They've become incredibly popular in the small business entrepreneurial world. A number of CIOs that I know at very large companies are part of mastermind groups. But we haven't seen this a whole lot in the broader corporate world at this point. But the idea here is that you bring a group of people together, peers, and you leverage the wisdom of peers and the exchange of ideas to develop yourself and everyone, for the entire group, to develop themselves as leaders, because you're applying these ideas of experiential learning and the wisdom of peers to help you move forward. They can be formal, they can be informal, they can be structured or unstructured. There's lots of different ways to organize them and operate them. But the point is that they focus on both peer support as well as this idea of idea exchange and experiential learning. And because especially in our corporate worlds today, and I'm using that term, whether it's you work for a government institution or a nonprofit or in academics, that any of our large institutions, they've all become very risk averse, very failure afraid. And so being willing to step out there and do what we're talking about here, this idea of experiencing, trying things, being willing to fail, learn from those failures, and to keep moving on can be very, very scary. And so having a peer group to kind of have that support of what you're doing is really, really important. And so my challenge to you is to take action somehow. Now there's a couple of ways, and I think David's going to talk a little bit more about this, but there's a couple of ways that you can do this. One is, in partnership with SDI, we are launching a series of peer advisory groups specifically focused on service desks and IT organizations, and this idea of how do we help people go from a management approach to a leadership approach. I know it's very limited. We don't have a whole lot of slots, but that's option one. The second one is, if you either don't have that budget or that's just not something that you're ready for, join the Institute for Digital Transformation. Membership is free, and in the next month or so we're going to be releasing a free guide on launching your own peer advisory group. Because like I said, you can do this yourself. There are some risks and challenges with that, but you can certainly do this on your own. So I would encourage you to take one of these two actions, or if neither of those is comfortable for you, then at least take these ideas that we've presented in this webinar today and figure out how you're going to move yourself forward and move yourself from being a manager to so that you can remain relevant and thrive in the digital era. So with that, I will wrap up my my prepared comments here, David, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion for the rest of our time.
Excellent, thank you, Charles. Some really great insight there. And yeah, really interesting to listen to the discussion of the industrial era and flat organizations and business savvy, collaboration and innovation, and also that end piece. And you're right, that's a very exciting thing for both our organizations, I think, as well. So before we go to the audience for questions, please, audience, if you've got any questions, if you could start sort of typing them into the console there. The Service Desk Institute has always advocated that the service desk should be influencers and leaders of change in any organization. I think it's fair to say the service desk is a place where technology and people meet, a place of insight and experience, and funnily enough, you mentioned delivering unique and personalized experiences. What do you think the service desk's responsibilities are related to creating leaders in any organization?
Well, I think the service desk is in a very unique spot. So I wrote an article a couple of years ago about the future of the service desk, and I think service desks in general are going to move into a very unique area within organizations, and that they're going to stand in the gap. I don't think that in the long haul IT is going to be the sole provider of technology. I don't believe they are any longer in the enterprise, and so the service desk is going to take a much broader role. I think actually service desk will probably get separated out of IT and be responsible for coordinating support across this massive ecosystem of technology that's out there. And as a result of that, these leadership skills are going to be vitally important. I also think that if you start thinking that through, and it goes away from being about, hey, I'm really good at helping you solve your office challenges, and how to use Microsoft Office, to, hey, I'm really good at helping you figure out how to leverage technology to do your job better. That becomes a really valuable skill across all aspects of the business. And so I'm not sure if it's a responsibility, but it's certainly an opportunity. I think service desks are going to become a breeding ground for the kind of leaders of the future.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And we're seeing some of that, I think, now, Charlie, in our engagements with organizations, certainly the more forward-thinking ones, which is really interesting. And you also mentioned the Peter Drucker's quote about leadership, he's doing the right thing, which is a fantastic quote. I love that quote. And it brought to mind one of my favorite TED Talks, which is by a lady called Rosalind Torres. And she talks about how great leaders anticipate change. They prepare for the future, they influence and shape the future, and don't just react to it. How would you define leadership in the 21st century?
Yeah, it's kind of like what I was talking about in the presentation. I actually think leadership itself changes, to be blunt about it. But I think what surrounds it does. I think in the industrial era, as we look forward, leadership was a little bit more narrow-banded, right? Yes, you may be a leader, but you're doing it within the bounds of your organization, and it's got its very specific mission and what have you. I think that in the 21st century, in the digital era, as we look forward into this, that the attributes of leadership, while they are the same, it's some of the stuff that I was talking about. I think what is fascinating is even within the confines of your organization, you have just a myriad of opportunities of where to apply that and how to apply it, because you're working with all these different people with all these different objectives, and things are moving so fast. I think probably that's the biggest change, is that things are moving very, very rapidly. And if I'm going to add one thing to it, or one attribute perhaps that's a little bit different of leadership in the digital era, is that you have to put technology into the mix. I don't think anyone who's leading an organization in any way, shape, or form can do that effectively, don't understand how technology plays a role in that. Because, I mean, I believe that technology is now the sole driver of competitive differentiation, competitive advantage in the marketplace, which actually speaks very well and bodes very well for IT professionals, because a lot of people in the business have come through, again, this industrial era kind of model where they would throw stuff over the wall and say, oh, this is IT's problem, and they felt like they didn't need to understand the technology, and that's coming home to roost. It's becoming a real issue on the business side that those folks are now at a significant disadvantage, and I think folks in the IT world that have the understanding of technology, if they can pick up the business acumen, that business savvy that IDG's report was talking about, suddenly now have the ability to bring both worlds together and to rapidly chart that course as new things are emerging. So I think that probably that's the one major difference, that to be a leader in the 21st century means to be a student of the technology transformation and how it's impacting your business and your industry.
That's really interesting you say that, because certainly recently, we've been meeting with numerous organizations, the likes of universities, some leading universities in the UK, and retail organizations as well, and they proposition that completely differently to some of the other IT organizations that we see. So when we talk about digital channels and how they relate to those, some of these organizations, and certainly the universities and retail, there's streets ahead in the way that they consider that as a change, and leverage that technology, as you said, to create value.
Right.
Do you know, one thing, when we've talked about this before, Charlie, is middle leadership, that layer in the organization, and you talked about their flat organizations and what that means to the future. And I think at the moment it's fair to say the middle leadership is a real issue for many organizations and industries, including IT. How important do you think it is that middle management layers, or how important do you think the middle management layer is to an organization's future? And maybe how does that manager to leader, that mastermind group concept support this critical layer as the business sort of moves forward?
Yeah, I think the story is going to be written on how these large organizations make these transitions. I don't think, at least in the short term, and by short term I'm saying in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a complete massive disruption in the hierarchical models. I think they're going to be changing, but I think this idea of middle management is still going to remain, and I think it's going to be critical. In most organizations, it's become a little parlor game.
Yeah.
We always try to figure out what the nickname is for this middle management layer, and we've heard everything from the sticky nougat, from the tar layer, to everyone has this layer because it's this nickname, because the middle management layer is where stuff gets stuck. You have the people on the ground that are doing the work, that understand what to do, and they're great at executing most of the time. You tend to have executives, especially in large organizations today, that see everything changing, and they're trying to move their organization, and it is in fact this middle management layer that is the sticky nougat, this tar pit that gets everything stuck. So I do believe that those organizations that can transform that middle management layer into a layer of leaders that are able to dynamically move and not have to wait for word on top, and are able to rapidly assemble and disband teams of their staffs to respond to the market, those organizations are going to be the ones that win. So I think it is absolutely critical for organizations from a competitive standpoint to fix the middle management problem that we've had in our large institutions for quite some time. And then I think it's also, I think, critical for everyone listening here, that if you want to be a part of that future, as that shifts, that you need to be thinking much more like what do you call it, like a middle, the middle layer leader versus a middle manager. And I think that distinction is subtle, but absolutely critical.
Yeah, and that comes back to the points earlier we discussed about seeing change, understanding that, and making decisions around that. Certainly. Do you know, Charlie? I could go on and on and talk over this stuff, but we've got some questions from the audience, I think, Zoe.
Yeah. So we've got a question here from Curtis, who's asking about how you deal with entrenched adversary to fail fast. So I suppose within an organisation itself, if there's a real sort of resistance to the fail fast idea.
Yeah, does that make sense, Charlie? Yeah. So entrenched adversity to fail fast.
Yeah, no, it's
cultural, surely.
It is absolutely cultural. There's a lot of reasons for it. I actually was giving a speech a number of years ago, and the title of the speech was "Learning to Fail," and the conference organizers were so afraid that no one would show up that they changed the title to like "The Secret of Success" or something, and of course nobody showed up. But I think that there is widely entrenched risk aversion here, and it's mostly because organizations culturally have been very, very bad at recognizing breakthroughs and have been focused on just kind of holding the line and status quo. Here's what I will say. I think there's a couple of issues. One is you need to be a part of leading the conversation. This is a cultural shift. Cultural shifts do not happen overnight. It's not simple to simply say just go do this. So I think part of it is bringing up this conversation that you cannot. I think there's sometimes this disconnect that people think you can have innovation and no risk at the same time. Doesn't exist. That the only way you get innovation, the only way you get agility, the only way you get the ability to respond to changes in the marketplace is by taking risks and creating an environment in which failure is acceptable. So the first thing is we need to start having this conversation. The second thing is I think we also have to understand that this isn't carte blanche. I was giving a speech in Florida about a year ago, and somebody was asking me a question similarly, and what I said is we have to understand that there's a difference between the operational elements that are meant to be stable. Those are the things that we can't accept risk, we can't accept failure in those areas. But then there's these other areas that are about our future, and those are the places where we need to experiment and try and fail. And so I think this isn't this wide stroke that, hey, you can fail with everything. You have to apply discernment to it and understand what parts of your job, what parts of what you're doing are the areas that these have to work. And that's where you apply things like ITIL and service management and COVID and all of the stuff that's about making sure that we have reliability, but then making sure that you also understand here are the parts that these are opportunities. This is where we can actually create value in the marketplace if we try this. And then how do we mitigate the risk to the enterprise while we're doing that? So the failing fast is a great approach because it means you're limiting your risk in doing that because it's these small little bits. It's not you don't launch this big giant project and then have it fail. You're doing it in little pieces. So I think it's about applying both of those. One, changing the culture, having those conversations, but then also bringing a structure to this where you identify those things that can't fail and you don't mess with those, but then you identify the areas where you need to be reaching and then you learn how to do small trials and fail fast in those areas.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Any more there, Zoe?
Yeah, so we've got one from Bruce. It's quite a long question, so bear with me, I'll read it out. He says he's been a business and IT consulting leader for over 20 years, and he says it seems to him that he can't underestimate the degree to which IT resources in the small and medium business markets will dig their heels in to resist the change that's coming. And management continues or contributes to that. But be that as it may, what recommendations would you give to IT leaders who find themselves in that situation but agree with everything that you've said?
You're probably not going to like my answer. To a certain extent, I think part of what our job here is to help people understand what's going on. Yes, I do agree that there is a degree of entrenchment that, and I think it comes from a couple different points, right? Part of it is that people have been, there's been so much thrown on them, and at the same time resources have been cut, staff has been cut, and so there's very little time to think. Here's what I will say. I think that most people are not averse to change. Most people just don't want change thrust upon them. When I have conversations, I've had this unique opportunity that I've traveled around the world having this conversation with people, I mean, New Zealand is a country of very small companies to, some of the biggest companies and government groups in the world. And what I found is actually a lot of consistency. Most people in IT, actually most people now even in business, but speaking specifically around IT, it's not that they don't see this. They see this happening. They know it's coming. They see, the cloud and the Salesforce.coms of the world rising up, and they see all of this. And there's a degree of fear that they understand that things are changing, and they kind of even recognize that they need to change. They just don't know what that means. And what they are afraid of mostly, and my joke is I'm a recovering consultant, so I mean I've been down this road. I've been in your shoes. They're afraid of people coming in and willy-nilly saying, well, this is the latest flavor of the day. You need to do this. You need to do that. And just spitting in their seat and not getting anything done. And by the way, at the same time, they have the continuing pile growing of all the stuff that they quote-unquote have to get done. And so I think that the real trick here is to have this conversation organically. Why? I mean, not to blatantly pitch this, but why am I such a fan of mastermind groups? Is it creates an opportunity, an environment for people to come in a safe haven to have these conversations, to think. I mean, the reality is most IT people in their day-to-day jobs now have no time to actually think, to contemplate, to even have the kind of conversation we're having right now about what the future holds and what they need to be doing about it. And so the idea, the construct behind a mastermind group means that you are carving out time every week, every 2 weeks, every month, whatever it is, where you're going to get together with your peers that are like-minded, and you're going to gain that support because you're going to force yourself to think through this. And so, if someone is truly entrenched, if someone doesn't believe any of this, if they haven't bought into this, if they aren't seeing any of it, and they really think that it is just status quo, it's the same old, it's been this way forever, it'll be this way for another 30 years, honestly, I don't waste my time on those people. They'll take care of themselves because everything is changing. That part I know for a fact, and it's just a matter of time before they're not my concern any longer. So I'm not too worried about those, but what I think you'll find more frequently is that people do understand, they are open to the change, they're just afraid of having their chain yanked a few more times and spinning in place and still ending up on the losing end of this. And so it's about creating opportunities to engage in those conversations. If you're a consultant, one of the things that I would highly encourage you to do is do some informal type mastermind groups where you get some of your customers together in an off-site, even if it's free, where everyone buys their own drink or something, and just have these conversations where you start breaking down these barriers and let people explore this, kind of in their own time and space.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. And certainly, I think, and we'll come on towards the end, the opportunity to be part of a group like that, specifically driven for service desk and IT support specialist is, I think, a very important thing, a very important factor in how we've worked together. Any more questions then? I think we've probably got time for one more, maybe. Do you think, Zoe?
Yep.
Yeah.
So we've got one from Norman who he's posted a couple of questions actually, asking whether you have suggestions for specific peer groups related to service desk organisations. But he's also asking about SDI's global reach and whether we have representation in the US.
Yeah,
so
interesting
Dave?
question. Well, I'll answer that relatively quickly, I think, Norman. We've worked with Charlie for a number of years, and recently debated what it means to be, an IT person, a service desk person in now and into the future. And this is how we've developed this proposition of these peer groups or mastermind groups specifically designed for managers to leaders. So the answer is yes, there is peer groups related to service desk organizations. Yes, it is a global proposition too, because the technology enables us to do that, and it's an opportunity to become part of a very healthy, forward-thinking network to support all the stuff that we've talked about today. There's more of that information on the website, and certainly, as we'll mention later, through any communications via Service Desk Institute or indeed Charlie's organization as well. Okay. Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up. There are a couple more questions there that have come through. I think what we'll try and do, if that's okay, guys, is capture some of the ones we've not answered and maybe post them online so you can see those. So yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. I'd like to thank Charlie for joining us today, talking about the digital future and leadership. And as mentioned, don't forget that you have the opportunity to become part of Service Desk Institute's new Manager to Leader Mastermind Groups, run in conjunction with Charles and the Institute for digital transformation. We'd be more than happy to discuss any questions you have via our helpline listed on the Service Desk Institute website, which is servicedeskinstitute.com, or by emailing hello@sdi-e.com.